She had a restraining order. She had multiple police reports on file. She had a law degree, a government position, and 6 years of documented evidence that her life was in danger. And on the morning of March 3rd, 2025, when she pulled out her phone and started recording the man walking toward her across that dirt road in the interior of Piauí, she was doing exactly what a lawyer would do, trying to create proof, trying to make the system work one more time. What happened next took less than 2 minutes. Her brother grabbed a gun, shot her once to bring her down, stood over her while she begged him to stop, and then fired at least 5 more times into her neck. Before he ran, he walked back to her body and took the phone. The video she was making of her own murder disappeared into the dry backland dust, and the man who ordered the killing from Goiânia, more than 1,000 kilometers away, was released from prison by a court decision in December of that same year. As of mid-2026, the shooter is still a fugitive. I don't think either of those facts is a coincidence. My name is Harrison Cross, and this is the Blackout Tapes. Today, we are in Paulistana, a small municipality roughly 470 kilometers south of Teresina, the capital of Piauí in the Brazilian northeast. The year is 2025, and the case is the execution of a 53-year-old lawyer named Valdenice Gomes Celestino Soares, shot to death on a rural dirt road by her own brother, in what investigators from the Piauí Civil Police have formally classified as a feminicide connected to a land inheritance dispute. What makes this case more than a local tragedy is what the investigation uncovered underneath the surface. A criminal structure involving at least 3 family members operating across 2 states. A weapon allegedly transported from Goiás to Piauí, specifically for the killing, and a timeline of documented threats that stretches back 6 years before the shooting. This episode is about what the files show, what they don't explain, and what the gaps tell us about a system that saw this coming and couldn't stop it. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to March of 2019, when Valdenice Gomes first walked into a police station and told officers that her brothers had threatened to drive to Paulistana specifically to cut off her head. Before the case files, before the police reports, before the wound ballistics and the missing cell phone, there was a woman with a life that took decades to build. Valdenice Gomes Celestino Soares was 53 years old. She had a law degree, a practice, and a position as legal advisor to the municipal government of Paulistana. The local prefecture described her in an official statement, released the day after her death, as an exceptional, ethical, and dedicated professional. That is the kind of language bureaucracies use when they are trying to say something and the formal register keeps getting in the way. The people who knew her said something simpler. She was the one in the family who understood the law, and she was the one who used that knowledge to protect people. She was also, and this detail matters enormously for understanding the motive, the court-appointed administrator of her mother's estate. In Brazilian succession law, that role is called inventariante. It is, on paper, a technical administrative function. You manage the assets of a deceased person until the inheritance can be formally divided. In practice, inside a large family with disputed land and old grievances, the inventariant becomes the person everyone blames. According to the investigative files reviewed in the case, the estate in question involved rural land in the municipality of Paulistana that the family patriarch had informally divided among his children years before his wife's death. When the matriarch died more recently, those informal arrangements needed to be legally formalized. Valdenice, as inventariante, was responsible for that process. She was coordinating the division of land that 14 siblings had stakes in. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 14 heirs, contested rural boundaries, a woman with a law degree holding the legal authority to structure the outcome. When I look at the case from that angle, The motive stops looking like a sudden explosion of violence and starts looking like the final move in a very long calculation. The land she owned directly was adjacent to property occupied by her brother Valdenice Gomes Celestino, 49 years old. According to police records and witness statements gathered in the inquiry, the boundary between their properties had been a source of recurring, deliberate conflict for years. Fences were repeatedly destroyed. Cattle were allowed through onto her land. These are not accidents in rural Brazil. Witnesses and investigators describe these as tactics, a slow campaign of provocation designed to force a confrontation, to wear down a woman who refused to yield. What Valdenice did in response to those provocations tells you something important about who she was. She did not escalate physically. She filed police reports. She gathered documentation. She went through the system. Court records show she obtained protective measures, formal judicial orders requiring her brothers to maintain distance from her and her property. She did everything the state asked of a person trying to protect herself through legal channels. And that, to me, is one of the most painful dimensions of this case. She trusted the instruments of the law she had dedicated her professional life to. She was wrong to trust them, not because the laws failed in theory, but because no law enforcement mechanism in Brazil in 2025 had a practical answer for what happens when a man with a gun decides to ignore a court order on a dirt road 400 kilometers from the capital. March 2019 was when the threat became explicit. According to police reports referenced in the case file, Valdenice formally documented that her brothers had told her in direct language that they would come to Paulistana to kill her. The phrase recorded in testimony was that they would pull off her head. That is not ambiguous language. That is not a heated argument that got out of hand. That is a stated intention communicated to the target, and it was documented by law enforcement at the time. Nothing legally decisive happened to the brothers after that threat. 2 years later, in May of 2021, the violence moved from words to action, though the target this time was not Valdenice directly. According to the inquiry documents, her ex-husband was ambushed and attacked on a public street. The assault was carried out by at least 2 individuals from within the family. A man investigators identify as Narciso Celestino, who struck the ex-husband with a wooden plank, and Valdenice Gomes Celestino, who delivered repeated punches and kicks and dragged the victim into the middle of the road while making explicit death threats. The attack only stopped because bystanders physically intervened. This is where the case, in my reading of the available documents, reaches what I think is its most consequential failure point. A group of men ambushed a person in broad daylight on a public street, beat him nearly to death, screamed that they would kill him, and were stopped only by the intervention of civilians who happened to be present. The logical response from a functioning criminal justice system is immediate arrest and preventive detention, because the pattern is clear. These individuals are not making idle threats. They are operationalizing them. The inquiry does not show any of the attackers being held on preventive custody following the 2021 assault. They remained free. And the absence of consequences, based on everything I have read in cases like this, does something very specific to a person who has already decided that violence is an acceptable solution. It confirms for them that they are untouchable. Valdenice, for her part, continued filing documentation. The protective orders against Valdenice were obtained and remained formally in effect. On paper, he was legally prohibited from approaching her. In the rural interior of Piauí, where properties share a fence line and the nearest police response might be 30 minutes away on a good road, a restraining order is only as strong as the fear it creates. And Valdenice had already shown in 2021 that he did not fear it. The 4 years between that attack and the morning of March 3rd, 2025, are not years of silence. Investigators and the family's legal representative describe them as years of continuous low-level provocation. destroyed fences, cattle driven onto her land, and the creeping psychological pressure of living adjacent to people who had already tried to kill someone close to you and faced no lasting consequences. Valdenice kept working. She kept filing. She held her position as inventariante. By early 2025, the inheritance process was still unresolved. The boundary disputes were still ongoing, and the brothers had apparently concluded that the legal route to removing her from the picture had been exhausted. The events of that Monday morning are reconstructed from witness testimony and physical evidence collected at the scene. The lead investigator in the case, Detective Taina Teixeira of the Piauí Civil Police, gave detailed account of the sequence to the media and in official statements. Valdenice went to her property in the rural zone of Paulistana to oversee repairs to a boundary fence. According to Detective Teixeira, this was not a routine maintenance visit in any ordinary sense. The fence had been deliberately destroyed multiple times by Adelaido. In Brazilian law, the repeated destruction of a boundary structure is a recognized tactic to contest ownership and force physical presence at the disputed location. Valdenice knew this was a confrontational space. That is why she did not go alone. She brought one of her sisters and a nephew. When Adelaido appeared, she did not retreat. She invoked the protective order. She told him he was legally prohibited from being there. And then she did what a lawyer trained in evidence gathering would do. She took out her phone and started filming him. Witness testimony from her sister and nephew, who were present until the moment the first shot was fired, indicates that Adelaido's initial reaction to being recorded was to leave the immediate area. That pause, in retrospect, was not a retreat. Based on what followed, I think he went to retrieve the weapon. Court records and police statements confirmed that he returned carrying a firearm. What followed was, by every legal definition and every factual indicator in the file, a premeditated execution. The first shot brought Valdenice to the ground. Her sister and nephew fled. According to witness testimony, as they ran, Adelaido pointed the gun at the sister and told her to keep running or he would kill them too. With her witnesses gone and her body already down, Valdenice, according to the testimony of witnesses who were close enough to hear before they got out of range, said to him, "Don't do this." He kept shooting. The forensic evidence indicates she was struck by at least 6 to 7 rounds. Detective Teixeira noted in official statements that the concentration of shots was in the area of the neck. That pattern is consistent with an intent to ensure death immediately and completely, with no possibility of survival or testimony. When it was over, Adelaido did not simply flee. Before leaving, he walked back to the body of his sister and took her phone. The device that contained video of his approach, his defiance of the protective order, possibly audio of the confrontation and the shooting itself. It disappeared. That phone has never been recovered. I want to be clear about what the taking of that phone means in the context of this case. This was not a robbery. There is nothing in the investigative records suggesting Adelaido had any practical use for his sister's cell phone. The phone was evidence. It contained images and sound that would have placed him at the scene in defiance of a court order in the minutes before the killing. He knew that, and he took it. That level of forensic awareness in a person who has just committed murder in front of witnesses on a rural road tells you something about the operational thinking involved. This was not a man who lost control. This was a man who had thought through the sequence of events in advance, including the cleanup. The investigation that followed is where this case transforms from a family tragedy into something with a much more unsettling structure. Police and prosecutors began examining phone records and communications data shortly after the killing. What they found pointed toward a second center of gravity, a man identified in police documents and court filings under the initials NGC, referred to in various press accounts and witness testimony alternately as Narciso or Tarcisio, another brother, this one living not in the backlands of Piauí, but in Goiânia, the capital of Goiás. more than 1,000 kilometers away. According to the investigative documentation reviewed by the Piauí Secretariat of Public Security, telematics records and device data extracted during the investigation indicated that NGC had maintained ongoing electronic communication with Adelaido in the period leading up to the murder. The nature of those communications, as characterized by investigators and the Piauí Public Ministry in their case filings, was not casual family contact. The picture that emerged was of a man in Goiânia who had been pressing Adelaido, persistently by investigators' accounts through messaging apps, to find a definitive solution to the problem that Valdenice represented in the inheritance dispute. The word problem, in this context, referred to a 53-year-old woman who was doing her legal job as administrator of an estate. But the phone records are not the most damning element. The family's attorney and witnesses who provided statements during the inquiry reported to investigators a specific allegation that NGC did not merely encourage the killing from a distance. He reportedly arranged for the weapon used in the murder to be transported physically from Goiás to Piauí, inside a private vehicle, specifically a Honda Civic, to arm the execution. If that allegation is accurate and is proven at trial, it places this case in the category of organized criminal conspiracy rather than a spontaneous act of violence. It means the weapon traveled more than 1,000 kilometers for one purpose. There was also, according to police documents, a third participant. Adelaido's own son, Valdenice's nephew, allegedly waited nearby with a motorcycle and helped his father escape from the scene immediately after the shooting. The inquiry characterizes his role as logistical support for the flight from justice. When I look at the structure of this case, what I see is a three-part criminal organization: a coordinator in Goiânia who supplied financing and the weapon, an executor in Paulistana who carried out the shooting, and a younger accomplice who managed the escape. The target was a lawyer, a public servant, and a woman who was doing her job. The motive was land. The operational planning included interstate weapon transportation, communication via encrypted messaging apps, and forensic countermeasures at the scene. That is not a family argument that went too far. That is a conspiracy. For 3 months after the murder, the investigation moved through the documentary phase. Phone records, banking records, witness interviews, device forensics. The arrest warrant for Adelaido was issued by a judge the day after the murder, March 4, 2025, meaning law enforcement moved quickly in terms of legal authorization. What they could not do was find him. He had already gone underground, using the same rural networks and geographic remoteness that had allowed him to operate with impunity for years. On June 5, 2025, the civil police of Piauí, under the command of Secretary Chico Lucas and with Detective Taina Teixeira coordinating the investigative arm, launched what they formally named Operation Cupiditas. The name is from Latin. It means greed or covetous desire. The police were naming the motive in the operation's title. The operation was coordinated across multiple locations simultaneously. In Piauí, officers executed search and arrest warrants at least 7 addresses connected to the family network. Adelaido's son was arrested. He was taken into custody for his role in facilitating his father's escape. The motorcycle, the route, the logistical support immediately after the shooting. His arrest warrant had been issued in May. In Goiânia, Piauí state investigators coordinated with local authorities to arrest NGC. He was taken into custody at his residence in the Goiás capital and transferred under heavy escort to the Piauí prison system, to a facility in the city of Picos, approximately 300 kilometers from the state capital. During the searches that accompanied his arrest, a firearm was found concealed at the Goiânia address. The discovery of that weapon in his residence, consistent with the investigative theory that weapons moved through his network, was described by the Secretariat of Public Security as significantly strengthening the prosecution's case. The operation also recovered multiple cell phones from various locations, devices that investigators hoped would yield additional evidence about the communications in the weeks before the murder. What Operation Cupiditas did not accomplish was the arrest of Adelaido himself. The shooter remained at large. He remains at large as of August of 2026, when official court publications from the Piauí Court of Justice listed him formally as a defendant residing at uncertain and unknown location. The legal language used in Brazil to summon a fugitive by public notice because the state cannot find them to deliver the summons in person. A man who fired at least 6 shots into his sister's neck at close range took her phone and fled. The courts are placing classified advertisements looking for him because he has successfully hidden himself in the interior of Brazil for over a year. I think that tells us something specific about who is shielded by geography and community networks in the rural interior and who is not. NGC was in custody from June of 2025. For the family of Valdenice, that was incomplete but real relief. The man they believed had ordered her death was behind bars. The criminal case was moving forward. The public ministry was building the prosecution. Then, on December 10th, 2025, a court issued a decision revoking his preventive detention. NGC walked out of prison. He began answering the charges against him as a free man. The reaction from Valdenice's surviving sisters, at least 4 of whom remain in contact with the press and with the investigation, was described in television interviews and media accounts as terror. They were not using that word loosely. These are women who watched their sister spend 6 years filing police reports and obtaining court orders that ultimately did not stop a bullet. Now, one of the men accused of engineering that bullet's path was free. One sister told interviewers in a statement quoted in multiple news sources that watching her family spill their own blood out of greed was something she still could not fully comprehend. The surviving siblings told reporters they feared becoming the next targets. The Piauí Public Ministry filed immediate appeals challenging the release. In the legal arguments submitted to higher courts, prosecutors cited concrete evidence of ongoing witness intimidation. Testimony from individuals scheduled to appear in the criminal proceeding who reported feeling pressured. Prosecutors also cited documented violations of other protective orders by remaining members of the family network as evidence that the risk of interference with the investigation remained active and serious. The legal standard for preventive detention in Brazil, as established by the Superior Court of Justice and the Federal Supreme Court, includes as a valid basis both the guarantee of public order and the convenience of criminal instruction. The prosecution's argument was that a man accused of orchestrating a murder for inheritance across state lines, whose alleged co-conspirator remained a fugitive, and whose release was followed by reports of witness intimidation, met every threshold the law established for continued detention pending trial. Whether the higher courts ultimately agreed with that argument was not resolved as of the documentary record available for this episode. What the episode shows clearly is that the release happened, that it frightened the surviving family deeply, and that the public ministry fought it. The Brazilian Bar Association, the OAB, responded to Valdenice's murder with a speed and force that reflected something beyond institutional protocol. The Piauí State Chapter, OAB-PE, issued a formal statement of repudiation. The Federal Council in Brasilia backed it. The sub-chapter based in Picos, the regional city closest to Paulistana, made the most pointed observation. Its president, Yana Moura, noted that Valdenice had filed multiple police reports over the years, had followed every legal procedure available to her, and had received in return a formal apparatus of protection that proved unable to stop a man who had already demonstrated in 2021 exactly what he was willing to do. That observation is not a criticism of any individual officer or any single judicial decision. It is a structural indictment. The OAB was saying, our system received every warning it needed in the correct format from the correct person, through the correct channels. And it still could not convert documentation into protection. 6 bullets to the neck on a dirt road in the interior of Piauí is the gap between those two things made visible. The municipality of Paulistana declared 3 days of official mourning. The prefecture issued a statement calling her an exceptional, ethical, and dedicated professional. Schools and public buildings flew flags at half-staff. The regional legal community gathered at the courthouse in Picos for a vigil. All of that matters. Institutions naming what happened, naming Valdenice specifically, by her full name, with her title, in official documents, matters. But I notice a dissonance between the eloquence of the mourning and the silence around the harder question. Why did the repeated, documented, officially received warnings that this woman was going to be killed not produce a different outcome? Here is what I think happened, and I want to be clear that this is my reading of the available documents, not a legal finding. I think this was not primarily a crime of sudden passion. I think it was a managed decision made over time by at least 2 people who had concluded that eliminating Valdenice was the most efficient way to resolve their objection to the inheritance process. I think the person in Goiânia, NGC, had the strategic intelligence and the physical distance to plan the operation without getting his hands dirty. I think Adelaido had the proximity and the accumulated rage to be the instrument of that plan. And I think the son with the motorcycle was recruited, whether under pressure, out of loyalty, or both, to complete the escape leg. The phone, as I discussed in the reconstruction of the shooting, was already the clearest indicator of operational premeditation. But there is a second layer of planning that I think matters just as much: the staging of the confrontation itself. I also think the decision to use a restraining order as the trigger point, to commit the murder in the context of a confrontation about a damaged fence, was either deliberate misdirection or a genuine breakdown in impulse control that happened to occur exactly where investigators later confirmed he had been repeatedly provoking her. Either way, it produced a crime scene that looked, at first glance, like a heated dispute that escalated. It took the phone records and the intercepted messages to reveal what was underneath. What I cannot prove, but what the pattern strongly suggests to me, is that the 6 years of escalating threats and physical attacks were not isolated failures of restraint. They were a sustained pressure campaign designed to break Valdenice's will and force her to step down as inventariante. When that campaign failed, because she refused, because she filed every report and obtained every order and held her position, the decision was made to end it another way. She was not murdered because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was murdered because she was effective at her job. The investigation as documented through mid-2026 leaves several questions open. The first and most obvious is Adelaido. He has been formally charged. His arrest warrant is active. The Piauí Criminal Court is moving his case through the proceedings using the public notice mechanism, essentially telling a fugitive through official publication that his trial is proceeding without him. That is legally valid. It is practically insufficient. A man who executed his sister on a rural road, who took the phone to erase the footage, who was helped by his son to escape, and who has now successfully evaded capture for more than a year. At some point, the question stops being whether he will be caught and becomes, what does his continued freedom say about the capacity of the Brazilian state to reach people who are protected by geography and community silence? The second open question is the status of the prosecution of NGC. The public ministry's appeals against his release were active as of the available record. Whether preventive detention was restored is not confirmed in the materials I reviewed. What is confirmed is that prosecutors considered his freedom to be a direct risk to the integrity of the criminal proceeding and to the physical safety of surviving witnesses. The third question, the one that the OAB raised and that I keep returning to, is systemic. The protective orders failed. Not because they were poorly written or because the judges who issued them made errors. They failed because the infrastructure required to enforce them in rural areas, regular police presence, fast response times, surveillance capacity, does not exist at the scale the law requires. Valdenice Gomes knew the law. She used the law. The law documented her danger in precise and repeated language, and it could not save her. That gap between documentation and protection is not unique to Paulistana, and it will produce more cases like this one. The estate of Valdenice Gomes Celestino Soares is presumably still in legal limbo. The inheritance that her brothers were willing to kill for is still, in all likelihood, tied up in the criminal proceedings that her death generated. The land that the fence was supposed to divide is still there, in the dry interior of Piauí, under a sun that doesn't particularly care who owns it. Valdenice is not there. What I keep coming back to is the sequence of those last few seconds. She's already on the ground, already shot once, and she says to her brother, "Don't do this." That is not a legal argument. That is not a police report. That is a woman looking up at a man she grew up with and trying, one final time, to reach something human in him. He kept shooting. She was alone on that road with a phone and a court order and a brother who had already decided. There was no system left to call. If new information becomes available about the capture of Valdenice Gomes Celestino, the resolution of the appeal regarding NGC's detention, or the outcome of the trial proceedings, this case will be revisited. The documentation is extensive. The crime is documented. The questions are not. This has been the Blackout Tapes. I'm Harrison Cross.